Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on academic resilience, what schools and countries do to help disadvantaged students in PISA. This topic is based on PISA's latest working paper available on the OECD's iLibrary page. The topic is also summarized in the most recent issue of PISA in Focus, which you can find on the publications page of our PISA website, www.oecd.org/PISA. Andreas Schleicher, Director for the Directorate of Education and Skills at the OECD, is joining us today to look at academic resilience, or the reasons why 15-year-old students from disadvantaged backgrounds perform at a certain level in PISA that enables them to play an active role in their communities and make the most of lifelong learning opportunities. Please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation to Eric Magnuson. Also, the PowerPoint that Andreas is presenting, along with PISA's working paper on academic resilience, are available as handouts. Just click on Handout at the top of your screen to download the results. Now to you, Andreas.
Thanks so much, Rose, and welcome. For many years, PISA has shown how social background can be a huge detriment to academic performance. And there's a strong link between the economic, social, and cultural background of students and their learning outcomes on the PISA study. At the very same time, we've always seen that that link is not deterministic. Some students will always succeed, despite coming from a disadvantaged background, who are somehow able to break that vicious circle between disadvantage from family and then poor performance in school and then poor kind of social outcomes later in life. And we've asked ourselves, what are those kinds of conditions and contexts that basically help students to succeed despite predicted kind of failure? But let's start from the beginning. This is just a map where you can see the countries that we are comparing, the countries that took part in PISA, in gray the OECD countries, and in blue the partner countries that joined our assessment. And this is another map where you can see on the vertical axis the success of students on average on PISA in the last assessment that focused on science. Sort of the higher you are up on the map, the stronger the learning outcomes in the country. And on the horizontal axis, you see a measure of equity. What we're talking about here is the strengths of the relationship between a student's social background in a country and the learning outcomes. If you are on the left side of the chart, it means social background has a huge influence on student success. If you're on the right side, it means students from all social backgrounds succeed in similar ways. And then you can divide that map into 4 quadrants. In some countries, learning outcomes are low on average, and there's a huge social gap. In other countries, on the lower right here, you have students who are not doing well on average, but sort of similarly across social backgrounds. On the left upper corner, you have countries that are doing well on average, but at the price of large social disparities. And then on the upper right side, you see those countries who've been able to reconcile high quality in learning with an equitable distribution of learning opportunities. Of course, that's where everybody wants to be. Some people look at a picture like this and say, well, this is all about context. It's all about, society. It's all about culture and so on. If that would be all of the study, you'd see that picture year after year and decade after decade. But actually, we've seen some really interesting changes in this picture. Now, if you look, for example, a couple of countries between 2006 and 2015. The United States started deep on the left side and moved, at least at the beginning, on the right side. You could actually see there's not been much improvement on average in the United States, but there certainly has been a closing of the achievement gap. You can look at Bulgaria, same picture, moving rightwards and actually also a little bit upwards. So here you can see a country that was able to, is still in the corner of poor performers and inequitable performance, but moving in the right direction. You can see Mexico moving to the right as well. You can see Slovenia moving to the right as well, and sort of closing the achievement gap. Or Brazil, actually raising performance and reducing the achievement gap. Or Chile, or Montenegro, or Thailand. So it's not a lot of countries where we have seen big changes, but at least a handful of countries among the sort of 75 countries that took part that have seen real improvements in closing the achievement gap. So the message here is, yes, we can change those kinds of dynamics. Here's another interesting way around it. Here you can see basically learning outcomes by decile of social background. Let me start with the Dominican Republic here. The red square are the 10% most disadvantaged students internationally in their learning outcomes in the Dominican Republic. The green triangle are the 10% students coming from the most privileged backgrounds, the learning outcomes in the Dominican Republic. So you can see actually there is a big social gap in the Dominican Republic. Some people who look at this data only say, well, yeah, poverty is destiny. You come from a disadvantaged background, you're going to have a lot lower learning outcomes. But when you look at this across countries, you can see that students from similar family backgrounds, students marked by a red square, have more or less the same social background across countries, same kind of family income, occupational status of parents, same educational and social resources, same kind of cultural activities. Their learning outcomes can still be hugely different. You can see, for example, the 10% most disadvantaged students in a country like Vietnam or Estonia or Hong Kong or Macau, those 10% most disadvantaged students in those countries do pretty much as well as the OECD average students. And actually, they do better than the 10% wealthier students in many of the countries in Latin America. So that's another angle suggesting poverty need not be destiny. And really, those kinds of analyses have brought us to analyze that question more deeply. What makes students in schools and perhaps education systems more resilient? So we define resilience as students' capacity for successful adjustment, even though they come from difficult circumstances. We know that socioeconomic disadvantage is one of those risk factors on average, but some of those students beat the odds and actually still do well. So how do we define resilience more precisely? Well, we look at socioeconomic adversity as relative socioeconomic disadvantage. We take the students in the bottom 25% of the national distribution of our PISA measure of social disadvantage. And then we look to what proportion of those students in that most disadvantaged quarter still reach PISA proficiency level 3 on all of the PISA assessments that we have done in reading, science, and math. Level 3 is sort of not great performance, but fairly good performance. That's where you can say students have mastered sort of the key concepts in mathematics and science. They can think like a scientist. They can design a simple experiment. They can read fairly complex texts. So it's not, great performance, but where you can say those students are going to make it. They're going to have the tools to continue learning and expand their horizon and probably have a reasonable chance to find a good job. So, and here are the results. The first thing, you can see how hugely that share of resilient student varies. In some countries, on the right side of the chart, you can almost say, poverty is destiny. There's only a slim chance that students from the most disadvantaged quarter will get to level 3 on the PISA scale. On the left side, you can see in systems like Hong Kong or Macau, it's more than half of the students. And in Singapore, Estonia, Japan, Canada, still around 40%. So great differences in countries in the share of resilient students. This is 2015. Let's have a look at the same data in 2006. What you see is that in most countries, actually, the share of resilient students has actually increased between 2006 and 2015. And I think that's a very important message, despite the fact that societies in most OECD countries are becoming more diverse, more heterogeneous, education systems have somehow succeeded to increase the share of resilient students. You look at countries, for example, like Slovenia or Germany or Japan or Portugal or the Russian Federation, Bulgaria, from various levels, they've been able to significantly increase the share of students overcoming the odds of social disadvantage. There's some who've seen also an decrease in the share of resilient students, of course, but the majority of countries have moved in the right direction, showing again that in a limited time of history, you can actually change those dynamics. You can increase the share of resilient students. Now, when you look at this chart, you recognize, well, there's some relationship. Strong performing students also have a greater share of resilient students. Yeah, that's what you expect because, those countries simply have more students reaching level 3. And you can summarize this on a chart. On the horizontal axis, you see the share of resilient students. On the vertical axis, overall student performance. And you can see, yes, there's some relationship. But, it's not deterministic. You take, for example, you compare students like Germany and Denmark, Belgium and Switzerland. They all are in the green box that you can see here. They have more or less the same learning outcomes, same share of students achieving level 3, but they vary quite a bit in the share of resilient students. So performance and resilience certainly not the same thing, neither at the individual level nor at the country level. So what makes a difference? We've looked at some of the factors that actually are correlated with the student's propensity to be resilient. And the first thing that we found is actually disciplinary climate, or the climate of learning, where basically students are in school where they feel that teachers care for them, where there is not a lot of noise and disorder, where they can sort of productively engage with learning in a positive disciplinary climate. You can see that the share of resilience is generally, the resilient students is generally higher. Basically, when you take one unit on the index of disciplinary climate, now that's one standard deviation on that index. On average across countries, you can see you virtually double the share of resilient students. And if you go sort of to some countries on the left side, it's many times. Here, for example, you take a country sort of somewhere in the middle, like Slovenia, Hungary, or Germany, you move one point on the index of disciplinary or learning climate, you double the share of resilient students. So the disciplinary climate seems a very important factor associated with student resilience. Now you can ask yourself in turn, so what stands behind disciplinary climate? What can we do as policymakers, educators to strengthen this? Well, we found two things. Generally, where teacher turnover has been reduced in countries, or where it's limited, for example, where countries have a strong collaborative culture in the school between teachers, and also a high prevalence of formal or informal mentorship programs. There you can see disciplinary climate typically being better. We don't know to what extent that relationship is causal by nature, but you can see that's certainly related. We also see where school principals bring teachers together, where basically the instructional leadership dominates the simple administrative leadership. That is something that seems to correlate with a better disciplinary climate. Obviously, disciplinary climate is also, influenced by the student body. But one of the things that we found very interesting is that disadvantaged students basically are more likely to be resilient if they are, among other students, who are more heterogeneous in their social backgrounds. So as school systems succeed to have less social segregation in their schools, you can see that disadvantaged students have an advantage. Now, some people look at this and say, well, if I make my school system socioeconomically more heterogeneous, basically reduce segregation, then what is that going to do to students from wealthy families and wealthy schools? Interestingly, we could not detect a disadvantage for the students. So heterogeneity seems to be advantages for students from disadvantaged backgrounds in terms of resilience, but we could not find a penalty for students from wealthy backgrounds, suggesting that actually, having a school system that is socially less segregated is overall an advantage if you want to strengthen resilience. Indirectly through disciplinary climate, but also directly. We also found that the number of extracurricular activities seems to be positively associated with student resilience. Now, that relationship is not that strong, and only in the dark blue bars could we detect that to be statistically significant, but still, it's one of the things that struck us. It may be that where students are in an environment that offers more learning opportunities, more time, more opportunities to engage with schooling, it could be that students find themselves more represented, that they feel school is more of a home for them, that school becomes more of a center of their life, and that may in turn, engage them and make them more resilient. We do not know, but that's what we can clearly see is that the number of extracurricular activities in school seems to be positively associated with student resilience. Now, what we did not find a relationship with was class size. In fact, what the data suggests is that bigger classes are positively associated with student resilience. Now, that may have many reasons. A simple explanation is probably that in many countries, we give the more disadvantaged students access to more teachers. We make those classes smaller with more difficult student groups, including students with an immigrant background. Often they get a more familiar, smaller setting, and that could simply explain that relationship. So I wouldn't read too much into this, but certainly we couldn't find that as a tendency, smaller classes would be making students or would be related to greater prevalence of student resilience. Again, there are trade-offs and choices involved. Some countries have their classes small, and then teachers have very little time to do other things than teaching and engage with the students, which again seems to be associated with better resilience. Other countries make their classes large and give teachers lots of time to do other things than teaching, work with other teachers, build a kind of environment in school where students feel well cared for. So these things are very, very important, but it is not as simple as saying, smaller classes, better resilience. Same for technology. We could not find any relationship between the prevalence and technology and student resilience. There may, again, be many, many reasons why those relationships don't exist or wash out with other factors and so on. But certainly, again, and you can generalize this, the kind of physical infrastructure around and the organization did not seem to come out in this analysis. It was more those kinds of variables that relate to the learning climate, to those teacher-student relationships, to those kinds of dimensions. Couple of other points that we found that science-specific resources at school are an important predictor of overall performance. Now, that's no longer resilience, it's just overall performance. For example, where the school principal said the material for hands-on activities is in good shape, where the school science department is well equipped, where they have a laboratory. And again, you can see that relationship to be quite strong before you account for the social background of students in schools, and somewhat weaker, but still significant when you actually take students from similar social and economic profiles. So this is a dimension, science-specific resources at school seem to be something that is worth kind of looking at. We also found that science competitions at school, I already talked about extracurricular activities, but here you can see one specific dimension, to what extent do schools offer scientific competition. And you can see that varies hugely across countries. And in some countries, those things don't exist, and others they're almost everywhere. What is striking, however, here, when you compare the blue dots and the blue diamonds and the yellow dots, you can see that in most countries, actually, those kinds of competitions are much more common in socially privileged schools than in disadvantaged schools. So in a way, if you want to strengthen resilience, you would design those things the other way around. Now, we know that those kinds of activities help students to become more resilient, but somehow we seem to amplify the impact of social background rather than reduce it. And unfortunately, that's true for many of the resource variables that we looked at. It's really, really hard to attract the best, the most talented teachers in the most challenging classrooms and to build the best resources around the most disadvantaged schools. Student and teacher behavior, not surprisingly, student truancy, students skipping classes, bullying, and so on, those seem to be negatively related to performance. And again, certainly very significantly when you actually see that they're mixed with social background, but even after you account for those kinds of things. I already talked about, segregation in education systems, stratification. One of the ways in which you can stratify education systems is by having students make choices between different programs. And we looked at this by the age of students here. Now, on the left side, you have countries like Austria, Germany, that select students at the age of 10 already between more academically and more vocationally oriented programs. And you have countries on the right side, who are making that decision at age 16 or sometimes even later. And we can see a very clear relationship between the first age of selection in the education system and social segregation. The earlier countries divide students up, the stronger the impact of social background on learning outcomes. We don't see a very clear relationship to the learning outcomes. But what you see on this chart is something very interesting. We measured the perceived support that students receive from their teachers in science lessons. We could really see that two things are related. So the earlier students are selected, the less support to students tended to report from the teachers. And remember, teacher support is again one of those variables of classroom climate that affects resilience. How could this be? Well, one hypothesis that we have is that if you have a more selective school systems, a more segregated school system, it's easier for teachers to pass problems on to someone else. For example, you can say, well, students in my class, one student is not good enough. I'll better send this student to a school with lower performance expectations. If you have a more heterogeneous environment, you need to take care of everyone. You probably are more likely to care for students differently and personalize learning more when that's part of your responsibility. I don't know whether that's the explanation for the picture. Is our current hypothesis. Finally, great repetition. That's another of those devices that seem to amplify the impact of social background and lower the kind of resilience. But it's still quite prevalent. The good thing is, if you compare that between 2015 and 2009, you can see in most countries, actually, great repetition has dropped quite a bit. Countries have understood that this is expensive, that this is ineffective, and that is stigmatizing. So many countries are reducing it, but you can see in the share of students still in a number of countries is about 1/3 or higher. So still a long way to go to eliminate that source of social segregation and lowered resilience. And really, that's all what I wanted to share with you so that we have enough time for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We have received several questions from our participants today. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that equity has improved in some education systems, such as the US, even though performance has not. And why do you think that is? Because some might argue that inequality overall has been on the rise in the US, and 20% of children live in poverty.
Yeah, but I think that's true. I think inequality has been rising actually in many OECD countries when you look at income inequality and other dimensions of this. But the United States is a good example where a school system has somehow been able to, moderate that impact of inequality on learning outcomes. And the US is not alone in it. You could see a number of education systems that have deliberate policies to actually ensure that they distribute their resources more equitably. And I think the United States should be credited for this. Of course, it's a pity that this was not sufficient to translate into overall improvements in the education systems, at least not in a way that they were statistically significant, but at least it's a very, very important step to put children on a level playing field.
Thank you. There's a listener who also asks about the importance of class size. You did mention that class size does not have an impact on academic resilience, but does PISA also account for factors such as how homogeneous the classes are, or how many students with intellectual disabilities there are in the classroom, or even how much support a teacher receives in the classroom in order to come to the conclusion that we did listen to your presentation and there is no definite conclusion, but do you think PISA looks into these issues, or do you think PISA will in the future?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a direct measure of disability and the special needs of students. What we do have is measures of the social background in the class. So we can actually measure the diversity of classrooms, and we can statistically account for that. And even then, we don't find that kind of relationship with class size. Again, there could be many things involved. There could be policies that deliberately place more disadvantaged or sometimes lower performing students in smaller classes to give them more attention. So you could see reverse causality in this kind of picture. There could be many, many things going on, but overall, we have studied that really carefully. What we see is that, when you have to make the decision, I spend $1 more on education, I could devote that dollar to a smaller class. I could devote that dollar to paying a teacher better. I could devote that dollar to giving students more learning time, to give teachers more time for other things than teaching, to give teachers more access to professional development. If you ask yourself that question, often class size doesn't come out very well. Basically, there are many ways in which we can invest scarce resources, at least as well, if not better, in improving the quality of the learning environment and strengthening resilience of students as well.
I think this brings me to my next question. Teachers would probably all agree that a more orderly classroom allows for better use of their time and their students' time. Does PISA ask questions or have data on how to create a positive classroom environment?
In fact, we are going to publish a report on this just in a few months' time, where we have administered for the very first time a teacher questionnaire on PISA, and this is one of the issues that we have raised really. What does constitute a positive learning climate, disciplinary climate? What are the kind of teacher capacities that actually teachers need to develop to ensure an orderly and productive learning climate? That's something that we're going to look at very, very shortly.
Great. We also have a question about teacher turnover rate. In your presentation, and I also believe in the paper on academic resilience, you mentioned that schools where there's a better academic and disciplinary climate, they tend to have a lower turnover rate among teachers. But did this study also address the impact of higher salaries for teachers or teachers' access to professional development?
We have not looked at this in this study, but we have generally data on that. And we can actually see that salaries are one of the predictors for better salaries are one of the predictors for lower teacher turnover. But there are other things as well. What we found generally that in a school climate of teachers have a fair degree of professional autonomy, but still work in a collaborative culture, self-efficacy of teachers was higher. So where teachers had spent more time in collaborative professional development, where teachers spent more time in designing and reviewing lessons together, classroom observations, where teachers spent more time in joint activities or joint lessons. Those were basically schools where teachers felt more effective as a teacher, and those were school systems where we could see lower turnover of teachers. So yes, salaries is one of the dimensions, but the general kind of approach to teaching and learning and the profession in a school is at least equally important. And again, what we found to be most important here is the combination of professional autonomy, and a collaborative culture in schools.
All right, thank you. I have another question about teachers. Do you have any data that show if teachers that come from disadvantaged backgrounds, are they able to create or help students become more resilient than teachers from advantaged backgrounds?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Unfortunately, so far we have not been able to study that because we don't have that kind of contextual data on teachers. But our new teacher survey is actually looking into this. We are looking at to what extent matching the diversity of the student population with diversity among teachers is something that helps students to become more resilient and counter social disadvantage. So again, our study that comes out in April is going to look at that.
Okay, great. And we also have another question on outside influences or structural forces. Does this study delve into external influences on academic resilience, such as access to social networks, housing, or healthcare?
No, unfortunately, we are unable to look into this, and we know that there are big differences across countries on this. In some countries, schools are very much academic institutions. In other countries, students provide or support a lot of social services. So there are big differences across countries, but that's something that we have not been able to include in the measurement of the socioeconomic environment.
All right, this also brings me to my next question. I don't know if PISA is going to look at maybe the impact parents have on academic resilience, for example, how involved they might be in the school, or even their stability, their access to basic housing or healthcare.
In fact, the parent factor is very important. We looked at this in relation to learning outcomes, and we can see that, of course, parental background is very important, parental income, that's obvious. But in fact, also parental behavior is a very powerful source. A simple fact where the parents ask their students, how was school? That doesn't take a degree, that doesn't take a lot of time. That's basically just showing your children that what they do is really important to you. That kind of variable had as high a predictive power on student learning outcomes than parental income. So it's parental behavior, it's parental engagement. Those kinds of factors are easy to underestimate in their relationship. And PISA shows that really well for the 22 countries for which we have those kinds of parent data.
Right. We have another question on transformational leadership. I think you spoke about it in your presentation, but could you explain better how you measured it and what is the style of transformational leadership of school principals associated with a better school climate?
Yeah, we basically surveyed school principals themselves. So these are their own responses to their leadership styles. And what we looked here is to what extent they make really the personal development, the development of the human infrastructure in schools, their priority. To what extent do they guide teachers? Do they ensure that teachers have access to good mentorships? Do they create a collaborative climate with teachers, a distributed approach to leadership? So those were the kind of questions that we asked principals. And what we are seeing here are their own responses to that. We did not have any kind of outside observation, and we didn't ask the teachers those kinds of questions.
All right. I have another question on digital using software technology in the classroom. And one listener was wondering if you have examples of best practices of countries that use digital tools for learning and teaching and how this helps academic resilience, or if it helps academic resilience.
Well, actually, this is the question very difficult to answer. If you ask me, do I know about an education system that is doing that well? I don't. I would have to say no. In fact, in every education systems in the OECD, we find a curvilinear relationship. In fact, a little bit of technology in the classroom seems to be conducive to outcomes, but the tipping point comes very early. And in virtually every country for which we have comparative data, technology intensities seem to be negatively related to outcomes. That being said, there are great examples at local levels. There are fantastic schools that do these things really well. There are local or groups of schools that have a strong tradition in using technology. But I don't think education systems have got very good at that yet, at least not according to the data that we have from PISA.
Okay, thank you. We have another question related to forthcoming PISA publications. In PISA 2018, you're going to evaluate global competence. And so this listener would like to know how the performance of students from disadvantaged backgrounds in the global competence assessment in PISA 2018, what do you think that the outcome will be?
And that's, of course, I can only speculate at this point. What we are measuring in global competency is, first of all, knowledge. To what extent do students have access to knowledge about the world? But we're also looking at their skills. To what extent are they capable to look at issues and problems from different perspectives, through different lenses, appreciate different ways of thinking, different cultures. We look at their attitudes to global issues and their attitudes to otherness. To what extent are they open to different views, different ways of working, thinking. And when you look at those dimensions, you'd expect that students from disadvantaged backgrounds often have much less exposure to that kind of diversity. They may know the job of their parents, maybe of some friends, but they certainly do not know the world of work as a whole. And in that sense, I think when it comes to global competencies, disadvantaged students could be penalized even more than when it comes to mathematics, where you can say, well, mathematics is something that you learn in school. There are very few other places where you're going to learn math or maybe even science. Whereas global competency is something that privileged students, advantaged students probably have a big advantage as a starting point, because they simply know so much more of the world and have access to so many more tools. So that would be my hunch, but obviously we're going to see when we have those data.
All right, thank you very much. This brings me to my next question. We have a listener who would like to know if you think participating in social action, community project-based learning, and problem solving around social issues is likely to contribute to increasing academic resilience.
Well, as you could see on this assessment, that generally extracurricular activities have a positive association in most countries with resilience, and it may simply be that students feel more part of the school community, that they see more meaning in what they do in terms of learning, because some of those extracurricular activities have nothing to do with learning as such, or nothing to do with academic performance as such. So I do think, I would deduce from that generally the more we can, engage students in school, in social activities, the better that's going to play out in terms of their resilience. And some countries that are doing really very well on resilience, think about, I showed you the data for Japan or Hong Kong. Actually, school is not just about academic learning. Students will do a lot of work together and by themselves. In the Japanese classroom, students clean their school with their teachers, and this is not because they can't afford a room cleaner. It's part of, we are in this together, or they cook the meals for their school. So there's a lot of engagement of students in social activities, even within the schools. And I could well imagine that this is at least one of the sources of the strength of those kinds of systems.
All right, thank you. Going back to disciplinary climate, we have a listener who doesn't really understand the distinction between school culture and disciplinary climate. Is there one? And if there is, could you please explain?
Well, disciplinary climate is certainly part of a school culture, but what we measured here specifically is really what happens in the instructional environment, in the classroom. There are lots of things of school culture that extend beyond the classroom, and we did not measure this in this kind of index. So this index, disciplinary climate, specifically refers to how students and teachers engage, to what extent time is well used, to what extent there are disruptions in the classrooms, and things like that. Sort of is more like an orderly, productive, friendly climate in a classroom that we are looking at here.
All right. We have another question on languages. Does PISA ask students if they speak more than one language, and does this affect resilience?
It's a very interesting question. We could study this because we know the language that students speak. The one thing that we did study here is that students who speak another language at home than the language of instruction have generally lower levels of resilience. So that was something working against them, even after accounting for a migration background. But that's an interesting question. We have, for a number of countries, we have those data. We could look into this.
I have another question that I think goes hand in hand with the Students' Wellbeing Report that came out in March. The listener asks, what do you think about mindfulness or meditation practices to increase resilience in students? I don't know if PISA has any data on that.
PISA doesn't have any data on this, but we know that there are some schools and actually some school systems that are experimenting with those, and there are some studies that show that can have actually very significant effect. Simply, a few minutes of meditation have shown sort of to reduce disruption and increase students' attentiveness, perseverance. So in that sense, it could well have a very positive influence on resilience. We don't know that from PISA, and we don't have the kind of data to study that in PISA. But I think, looking at issues around mindfulness, meditation, I think this is worth to study those kinds of things in a lot more detail.
Okay, thank you. I have another follow-up question. If you were to give advice for a sweeping reform to help disadvantaged students' performance in school, what reform would you advise governments to tackle first, or where should education systems concentrate their resources?
There are some quick wins, some things that are easy to do. For example, we could align resources better with the needs of students. England has recently done that by creating a pupil premium. Basically, in a disadvantaged school, a school will get additional resources, and they have to figure out, how we're going to use those resources. The school is accountable to that, reporting on those outcomes. So that actually is not just more money for disadvantage, but it also means that schools have to think harder about, how to support students who need this most. I think that's an easy win. Actually, formula-based funding has become quite popular in OECD countries. If you want to go one step further, it gets harder. And this is about, how can we attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? How can we align the human resources with the needs of students in a more productive way? That's much, much harder to achieve. But I give you some positive example. For example, you can look in China, Shanghai. They are pairing high and low performing schools so that schools have more, opportunities to capitalize on the experience of disadvantaged schools, have more exposure to performance in high performing schools. They build many careers around disadvantage. If you're a vice principal in a high performing school and you want to become principal, well, then, you do that best by taking on a more disadvantaged school in a sort of rural area. So there are many, I think those are the kind of things where government policy can do a lot, creating a better match between the resources and the needs of students. And that's the government angle. At the level of teachers, clearly, you'd like teachers to be very, very good at diagnosing how students learn differently. Now, to be able to have the time, the resources, and the means to actually understand how students learn, to not only know their subject well, but also, and not only know their students well, but also understand how their students actually learn. And that means also giving teachers enough time to do other things than teaching. And often we think, well, the job of teachers is to be in the classroom and tell students something, but in fact, the kind of opportunities that teachers have out of the classroom to support individual students, to basically engage with each other, to discuss student results collectively. Finland devotes almost 30% of student learning time to learning outside the classroom context. I think those kinds of opportunities are crucially important to strengthen resilience, to ensure that all students get the help and the support that they need, and that every student has access to excellent teaching.
Okay, that is very interesting. We have a listener from Brazil who is asking, or has a comment saying that more than 40% of school teachers work on temporary ad hoc contracts, and what kind of impact could such a situation have on disciplinary culture?
Well, as you could see from the chart I showed you, that generally the stability of the academic staff of a school is an important predictor of the disciplinary climate. So you'd hope to have as much stability in this stuff.
And then what do you think about school courses for the whole day versus only half day as a means to boost social mobility?
Yeah, I think this is a very important consideration. In fact, many countries have moved towards full-day schooling, giving learning more time, giving teachers more opportunities, more time to counter social disadvantage, to provide better support, but also to identify and nurture talents of students. So learning time as a whole sort of school context is certainly a very important dimension. That, I think, is something that many countries are doing. At the very same time, there's also a caveat to this. And what we see, for example, when we look at learning outcomes and equity even, is it's often not only the quantity of the time, but also the quality of the time. Now you have, for example, students in Finland not spending that much time in school, but doing really well. So they learn a lot in very little time. You go to a country like the United Arab Emirates, where actually learning time is, school days are very, very long, but learning outcomes are not so great. So I think learning time can be one important resource that schools can use to foster resilience and student learning in general. But it's also very important to look at how that time really is spent.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about standardized tests. How will standardized tests help to measure student outcomes across various countries? The listener mentions that in the US, the SATs or the ACTs are the primary standardized test measurements.
Yeah, I think countries have different metrics that they're using. Standardized tests are one important way to measure learning outcomes because they provide a comparative perspective, comparative perspectives within and across the school and so on. And they're quite common across countries, but there are other forms as well. We have many countries that also use a lot of teacher-developed tests that use not only standardized tests, but also more formative approaches to assessment so that there is more of an interaction between the learning outcomes and improvement efforts. There are various forms of assessments, but I would say that standardized tests have an important role. What is, in my view, more important than the nature of the assessment is the quality of the assessment. What has often happened in standardized testing is that we have sacrificed validity gains for efficiency gains. Now we use lots of multiple choice questions because they're cheap to administer, and we lose track of the kind of nuances that we want to really assess, the kind of qualities in students' knowledge and skills that we're really looking after that may require more complex, more sophisticated response types. And for that reason, for example, PISA uses a lot of open-ended tasks where students have to design an experiment or respond to a very complex kind of task, write their own answers. So I think it's not standardized, it's the quality of the assessment. Now, making sure that we don't sacrifice validity gains for efficiency gains. In the same way, also making sure that we don't sacrifice relevance for our reliability. Now, that we make sure that we actually measure what we are looking for, rather than just looking at getting the most reliable kind of score. So I think there are very important questions on the quality, but standardized assessments can certainly, be delivered at a very high level of quality too.
I have another question about access to resources for disadvantaged students. A listener asks, what do you think of arranging study tours or excursions or exchange programs for disadvantaged students to enhance academic resilience?
Yeah, I must say, we don't have any data from this, but I think the idea is very important. The more and the earlier we can give students from disadvantage an idea of the world, an idea of the opportunities, the more I think we can do for them. There's been just a study in England asking children actually early on in their lives to draw their future. And what you could actually see is that students from disadvantage had a very myopic view of the world. They only knew sort of very, very few things around them. What you can do in those cases is, and this was about, their future dreams for their occupations. what you can do is, bring people from the real world into schools, show students about, what kind of occupations there are, what they need, why they should study hard to mathematics, because that's what they will need in many occupations. So I think bringing the world of work into schooling can be one way. Or, as you say, bringing students out of their environment, I think giving students real exposure and experiences of the richness of the world. If you come from a wealthy background, you'll have that by nature with your family out of school. If you come from a disadvantaged background, this is very important. I mean, if we want to motivate students to invest, learning is hard. If you study math and science and those subjects, they really demand a lot of time and energy. And to understand why this is necessary, you'd like to see as a student, or you would wish that students see that, the application of those kinds of skills. And I think it's important to do those things early on. There's a lot of research around it. Unfortunately, we have not collected that kind of data in PISA.
Okay, we also have a question from a Canadian. This person writes that they're interested in resilience in refugee and indigenous students. And has the OECD, has the Education Directorate looked at studies with special populations?
Very important subject. In fact, in May, we are going to publish a study especially on that, where we looked at academic resilience of students with an immigrant background. Very, very interesting results.
There's another question about STEM. Are there any education systems that help girls study STEM fields, science and maths and engineering?
Well, if you look at schooling, the results from boys and girls at age 15 are not so different in most countries. Where we see much greater differences in the attitudes and dispositions of boys and girls towards science. Now, the PISA results show, for example, that when you ask students, are you seeing life opportunities for yourself, for your country in science, that's where girls usually have much lower rates than boys. So in terms of learning outcomes, I think school systems have done fairly well in eliminating the gender gap in terms of those kinds of aspirational and attitudinal variables. And also here, career expectations. Now, that's what we measure in PISA. You can see big differences between boys and girls. And then, you see them reflected in the career path, clearly. There are some countries, when you look at later ages, now when you look at this in university, though, that have made real big changes. I want to credit Italy, for example, a country that historically had huge gender gaps in universities, in the share of university students, women who entered sciences and computer fields of study. And that has been actually dramatically being reduced. So it's also showing us, yes, those things are often deeply entrenched in societies, but policy certainly can make a difference.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And thank you to our participants for your interest in PISA and the OECD's work on education. If you would like to find out more about PISA, we invite you to visit our website, www.oecd.org/PISA. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the PISA website. Once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Andreas, for your presentation.
Thank you all.